So let's move on then to 18G, Conservation Partner Spotlight. Secretary Walsley, informational. An overview of a key conservation partner program will be shared with the Commission. Secretary Walsley.
Thank you, Chairman Johnston, and a standing thank you to Vice Chair East for the genesis of this agenda item. It is a standing agenda item that gives us an opportunity to become more aware of some of our conservation partners around the state. And so as we travel around the state and host meetings in various places, it gives us an opportunity to hear what some folks are up to, what their issues and concerns are. Again, Chairman Johnston, I'd like to reiterate some of your statements and expressing a lot of thanks to White Pine County. It's been a long time since we've been over here, and you know, going out in the field yesterday and ending up down at Cave Valley Ranch was, to me, indication that we probably need to come over here a little bit more frequently, because there was too much to do and not enough time to do it in. So I know we have a lot of meetings in Reno and Vegas, and I think there's great value and great attendance at some of these rural meetings, and this one is no different. So I want to echo your sentiment of thanks to White Pine, and introduce Mitch McVickers to kind of who wears several hats here in White Pine, and kind of explain to you what he's involved in, what those groups are up to, and just kind of inform the Commission on some of our conservation partner activities in this part of the state. Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you, Director. Mitch McVickers, for the record. I do have quite a few different things I'm involved with in White Pine, and on behalf of all the groups, thanks to the department and the Commission for all the work that's went. We've had grants in 2017 for our shooting facilities, and that's all been completed, and currently another grant at our trap and skeet range with a new building. And with that one, we're actually, the archery club got involved with that, which I'm the president of the archery club, so, and a member of the trap club. But we all teamed up to get this new building, and right now we're shooting our archery facility to shoot in the winter, and inside is the old dairy barn that's in McGill. I don't know. It says White Pine Archers on the roof right now, and that was the original name of the archery group. And I just got off the phone with a family friend that actually grew up down there at the dairy when that was the dairy. His dad and him ran the dairy, and they moved from there in the 50s, and actually the house got moved up to a different location in McGill. But from the nearest information I found, the archery club started in the early 60s, shooting inside there. Around 79, 80, it was changed to the Bristlecone Bowman. I don't know why they changed the name, but they did, and it's been the same name since then. I've been shooting over there since I can remember. We used to have a lot more indoor shoots over there as a kid, but right now there's no water in the building. There's no bathrooms. It's got heat. We redone some heat in there, so it's a little warmer to shoot in the winters, because we usually shoot January till April, kind of when everything gets busy. We shoot once a week with our winter leagues, and it's been a good turnout. Last year we actually had more kids than adults, and that's kind of been my push. So we have obviously our indoor shoots, and they called it the Budweiser Invitational. There was quite a few people would come in and shoot, and used to have turkey shoots during Thanksgiving, and used to have a lot more activity, it seems like, and I'm hoping to kind of build that back up with these other facilities. And it seems like most of the women want a bathroom, and can understand. But it's, the county actually owns a building and we just do the maintenance on it. So it's somewhere to shoot right now. But with our other shoots, we have a 3D shoot. We hold it the first weekend in June every year. And it's usually at Camp Success. We have had it at Cave Lake for 2 years. When the Camp Success got redone, they did a bunch of work up there. And this last year, we actually had to move it because of the snow. There's no way you could even get in there. The county tried to clear the road in, but we couldn't do that, and we moved it to a local rancher's private property and held the shoot, and actually had 175 registered shooters. So that was one of our best years we've had since I've been involved with it again, since moving back to Ely in '05. So it's growing, and there's a few people in the crowd I've seen at the shoot, and I hope to get more. I've had a lot of discussion about it. So Camp Success seems to be a lot funner as far as the lodge, and it's a fun weekend. So, and then on to, plus with the McGill barn and then the new facilities we're building, we have the Mosier range, which with that grant, the Mosier range has been there since I was a kid, but we have a up to 80-yard practice range set up right now. And then there's a 14-target loop that you can go. We built shelters for all the targets to keep them out of the weather. And you can go walk that 14-target loop and shoot there as well. So we've got a lot of opportunity just in the archery end of it. And then you look at, I don't know if anybody's been out to where the trap range is. It's just on the way to the prison. But that facility was put in the 80s. And not a lot of progress has been done out there until 2017. Steptoe Valley Trap and Skeet was established. And since then, it's been a huge improvement. We actually, with that club starting, they started the Trap and Skeet. We got a USAES youth shotgun team that we went to Elko. A lot of the kids went to Carson a month ago to some shoots, and we held a state shoot here this year. And with that new building, it's going to just be nice to have that facility in the future years. But with the facility we have out there, we're sharing it with the 4-H when they do their shooting competitions for shotguns. The Boy Scouts use it. They use the archery facilities as well. Most of the clubs do. The archery in schools, we've helped buy kits for the high school, middle school, and the charter school. So we're going to hope they utilize this facility to go out there and shoot too. And then with the Steptoe Valley Trap Club came the long range shooting, which is really popular nowadays, and then an NRL 22 league, which is a small bore. There's kids from 6 years old to adults and their grandparents out shooting with them. And them guys have 10 shoots a year. They have different shooting positions and shoot out to 100 yards with 22s. And that's grown a lot of popularity around too. And it's a national group, so all your scores are combined nationally. You're shooting against kids all over. So that's been pretty neat. The long range shooting group, they have 8 shoots a year. Last shoot they had was an ATA shoot. They had the range certified, so it's a sanctioned range for ATA. So they had 22 shooters. They were from Logan, Utah to all over Pleasant Grove, Cedar City, Vegas, Elko. I think they had one guy come out of California. But they call it a MOA shoot, so they start shooting at 100 yards. So with 100 yards, it's an inch by an inch. And they shoot out to 1,000, so you're shooting at a 10 by 10 target. And that's really been popular too around the community. With the trap range as well, we we try to open the range up Wednesdays and Sundays for anybody who wants to shoot, and that's when most of the youth team shoots for their practice. And NRA's kicked in with our youth team. They've supplied almost all the shells for our kids to shoot this whole year. So all these different groups really made a huge difference in that facility. And you know, just to thank everybody again, the 2017 grant for the shooting facility, and then the previous grant that we're working on right now, and the building we're building. We're hoping it's not just the shooting as well. The UTV club, we've contacted them. We're hoping they use it for their start point to go for rides. They'll come back, have lunch, and you know, any other groups that want to utilize it, we're hoping everybody does. And then I was asked to talk about some of the lakes and the different other activities people in Ely enjoy and around, but obviously we heard about Sports World and the licenses. I didn't realize that they sold that many, but it's pretty obvious when you go in there. There's always people in there, and then you go to Cummins Lake and Cave Lake, and they're always full. Cave Lake, most summers you cannot find a spot to camp that night. They'll overflow to Elk Flat campgrounds, but even sometimes that's full. So talking about Cave Lake with the project we discussed yesterday in the visit, you know, to drain that lake, it's going to make a pretty big impact on just the recreation part of it for the kayakers that we talked about seeing there. And hopefully we can get that addressed, and I understand the amount of time all that takes, but it will make a big impact on the activities up there. There's a concert at Cave Lake they had a few months ago, or a month ago, and they said there's over 2,000 people up there. They had a pontoon set up out on the lake, and that's where the band was. And it was through the night. It was a pretty nice event, and there's a lot of activities that go on up there all year long. So Cummins, hopefully the boat dock someday, huh? That's been a project, but we do appreciate all the work on that as well. Then the Pike, I don't know what we're ever going to do there, but my kids, they actually take off from the house on the side-by-side and fish out there multiple times a week with their buddies, and I always get pictures of all the pike on the shore, and it's crazy. But Bassett, I don't know, we put a lot of fish in Bassett Lake, and it seems to be getting a lot more use, I guess. But Kennecott, the dam's got some issues, and so they've actually closed the driving access off across the reservoir. You can walk out there, but I don't know. I know they've contacted the division, and I think there's still more to come with that, but hopefully we can do something there to make that a good facility. Illipods seems to be pretty popular still, and always people out there ice fishing. They really like that lake. And Sunnyside is busy as ever. Sunnyside's gotten a lot quieter at my meetings, but the cab meetings, so something down there's improved, and thanks to whoever. But I haven't heard near the complaints on the water levels, and everybody seems to be a lot happier about that. But that's all I had. Just a lot of activity, lots of opportunity. So thank you guys. Any questions?
Any questions for Mitch? Commissioner East?
I can get my mic to work. Thank you, Mitch. This is always one of my favorite parts of our meeting, and I love that people are getting outside and that kids are getting involved. The amount of activity that the kids are doing is really, really great to see. So thank you for coming up with programs and opportunities for them.
You're welcome. Hopefully one day we got a big dinner like they're doing in Lincoln County, and since a lot of them elk are killed right here, it'd be pretty neat to have a dinner here and auction them tags off right here. And then we can help with a lot of these projects. Just you got to add that to my other.
That was a nice closing. Any other questions? Thanks again, Mitch, for everything that I'm sure you and Commissioner Olmberg and I'm sure Commissioner Olmberg's family have all been instrumental in the great hospitality we received here. So I want to just thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Secretary Wosley.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a thanks to Mitch and point out, he's talking about, the 22s and the long range and the trap and skeet and the archery, all those opportunities to shoot with or without bathrooms or heat are opportunities to get new people in. Like we talked about the youth, but they also all pay federal excise tax on all that equipment. There's 11% federal excise tax. If you don't have a place to shoot, you're not going to have archery equipment sales, you're not going to have ammo sales, and without the sales, you're not going to have the money to do the projects and pay for the people. And so even though we're talking about, these opportunities for families and people to get together, the bottom line is that's how we pay for conservation, and that's tens of millions of dollars. It's a huge chunk of the Department of Wildlife's budget, and we use the tag and license revenues as the match to get those federal dollars that are collected from those federal excise taxes. And so every time you squeeze that trigger, 11% is going back to conservation. So those are really great activities that pay dividends year round.
Chairman Johnston.
Deputy.
Jack Robb for the record. As Director Wosley mentioned yesterday, Sports World's been a great ally of the department, and every time I come out I go in and speak to a lot of their staff, and we have a former game warden that works there, and he said since that trap club opened, their sales on shotgun and shotgun equipment's up over 20%. And what he really wanted to stress was the amount of young people he sees waterfowl hunting, sage grouse, blue grouse, rough grouse hunting. You're getting that shotgun in their hand is introducing to that shotgun, which allows them to go pursue other activities in the field. Ely's been predominantly a big game hunting community for years, but when staff at Sports World is saying, hey, we're seeing a shift and we're seeing young people with shotguns in their hands participating in other activities, it's a direct relation to the trap club being there. It's working, and it's a good model we'd like to put in other places too.
Okay, so I guess we have a decision to make. It is 11:20, and we have the County Advisory Board workshop session, which has 5 subparts. So we can either try to plow through that and not break for lunch, or we could take a break for lunch now and come back and do the cab workshop. Yes.
Well, I ran my dogs, so we can do either one. I'm open.
I already announced that for you. How long do we think I don't want to get halfway into the workshop and then I'm starving hungry and I want to just...
And that was going to be my comment. I mean, these are things that we've heard from the cabs that they wanted the opportunity to discuss, and I wouldn't want us to be in a position where we're either hypoglycemic or we get cranky and we're trying to rush through it. But I will also say that even though there are 5 subparts, really A is going to be 30 seconds. So there's 4 subparts, and what we've tried to do is we've endeavored to put something together that makes each of these compartmentalized to where we could do one part and break and come back and do another part, even though they lead, there's a natural progression. I think they're compartmentalized enough to where if we did need to take a break, we certainly could between some of those items, if that's your desires.
let's get started then. And if we want to take a break, I suspect we're going to take a lunch break. I'll say too, this is something I wanted on the agenda that I asked the department to put on the agenda for the cab workshop. And so I don't want to cut it short at all. So I think we'll probably break for lunch, but we might as well get started. It is still pretty early. So with that, we'll move on to agenda item 19, the County Advisory Boards to Manage Wildlife Workshop Session, informational. Welcome and opening comments. Chairman and Secretary Wosley, informational. The department will provide an overview of the quota and tag setting process, beginning with the collection of field data and concluding with the draw process using mule deer as the primary example.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I just said, this is an item that we've heard from the county advisory boards, a desire to have more information, more knowledge. I think in particular, Clark most recently has expressed that. You yourself have asked for some of these items, and we've done this a few times historically. I think the cab workshop venue is an excellent venue in which to do this, and I hope that we can go through this and really compartmentalize the survey and inventory piece and have opportunities for engagement and questions and kind of tie a bow, if you will, around that before we move to the model and population estimate piece, et cetera. And I know that certainly there are, you indicated that, we're in the description of the agenda item that we're going to use mule deer as the model, the primary example. But there are similar processes and constraints and survey methodologies. It's a really same process for all the other big game species. The one difference is that we have more survey data for mule deer than the others. Mule deer is the one species that we try to survey a couple times a year. So there may be some times during this presentation that you all have questions. I would encourage you at any point that you have a question or don't understand where the presenter is going, don't hesitate to kind of interrupt. And I think that's really the value of the workshop format, is it provides opportunity for engagement. So I would invite and encourage that kind of engagement along the way. And I may do that myself as we're going through some of this, having been a game biologist in a past life and having had the opportunity to dive into a lot of the history and being part of some of that history. I might weigh in and provide some clarifications or additional information along the way. But I think this is a really good example going from how we survey, why we survey, the information we get, to what do we do with that information in the modeling process, to how does that output of the modeling process result in a quota recommendation, and then how that quota is eventually filled through CalComy's efforts and the business rules on our draw process. So with that, apparently I'll turn it over to Cody McKee.
And Cody, just before you get started, I think I was asked last night by members of the public, could they ask questions during the workshop? And I'd invite that too. It's an informational item. So if there's questions from CAB members of the public during the presentations, I hate to harken back to school days, but kind of raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye out there. I don't want to have to hold all questions until the end. So, Cody?
Chairman Johnson, members of the commission, thank you for letting me come and present this section of...
Wait a minute. Are you now 19B?
19B, that's correct.
The agenda item, I believe. We're moving on to 19B, Mule Deer Survey and Inventory Wildlife Staff Specialist Cody Schroeder, informational. The department will... They're putting the wrong names, aren't they? All right. Cody McKee.
Chairman Johnson.
Wait a minute. I got to finish reading the agenda item. Cody McKee, informational. The department will provide an overview of methods and strategies used to inventory mule deer abundance, distribution, and herd composition. Cody. I'm just going to say Cody. I'll probably get it 3/4 of the time right, no matter who's speaking.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. Cody McKee, for the record. It's easy to get Cody Schroeder and I confused, so I never blame anybody when it happens. This time, because of the topic, we decided that it may be more appropriate for me to discuss, and that's primarily due to some of the new techniques that we're going to be providing an overview of related to aerial survey of mule deer populations. So just to provide a little bit of background, I did a rough estimate from surveys a couple years ago. The game division flew about 1,500 hours of big game surveys across all of our species. That's a significant amount of time to spend in a helicopter. And flying is inherently dangerous. So as cool as the work is that we're doing, we're collecting some very valuable information that's really the starting point for this population modeling, demand success, and ultimately the tag allocation process. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the how, the when, and the why we survey. I think that the why and the when really plays into the how we survey and why we as a game division have been investigating some alternative or I guess maybe some more modern methods for surveying our mule deer herds. So we collect age and sex data of our herds to inform and calibrate our population models. These are our fawn and buck ratios that you often hear us discuss. Essentially, these are a proportion of the number of bucks per does that are observed on survey and a proportion of the number of fawns compared to does observed on survey. And then secondarily, we get this opportunity to evaluate large-scale landscape changes, particularly wildfire effects, recovery from wildfire, potentially habitat treatments, kind of like the chainings and thinnings that we reviewed yesterday. That aerial live view of the landscape provides a view that you cannot get from the ground. And so it really gives this unmatched opportunity for our biologists to learn more about their resource area. So we survey twice a year. We have a post-hunt survey. We also have post-winter, our spring surveys. You'll hear me kind of use post-hunt and fall surveys synonymously, as well as post-winter and our spring survey together in concert. So these post-hunt flights, we try to time them as close to the peak of rut as possible. And some of the work that staff specialist Cody Schroeder has done has shown that the peak of rut generally in Nevada is sometime around Thanksgiving weekend. So you can, or Thanksgiving week. So you can imagine that does kind of create some issues for our personnel and timing around the holiday period. We also have challenges with migratory behavior of herds and timing those surveys during that peak of rut. We have overlapping elk hunts that go on during that time, and we're very conscious of flying over elk hunters that may have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And then we also just have personnel fatigue. People are in a helicopter a lot, and sometimes it's hard to find enough people to actually get out and fly. And our spring flights, that's kind of the real, we're getting likely the most important data point that we can for our population modeling effort. And this is our overwinter fawn loss. It's an index of recruitment, so we're looking at those fawn ratios. And that's telling us how many more deer are we adding to our population, taking into account anything that's been lost through the winter season, as well as harvest the previous year. So this resulting data gives us this estimate of fawns that we're expected to come into the following year. Now when we talk about the why and we talk about the when, that leads us to how do we survey. And traditionally the department has used a directed search method. We're also evaluating and starting to integrate this sample-based approach, which you may have heard some of our biologists discussing as polygon flights. This is an effort to incorporate randomization into our surveys, as well as maybe find some ways where we can address those issues of timing our flights during the best time of the year. And if I just can backtrack for a second, we want to fly around the peak of the rut because that's when we expect the bucks to be the most detectable on survey, and we want to fly at the best time where the deer are most visible, and that's due to reproductive and mating behavior. So the directed search aerial survey, imagine for a minute that these are just two neighboring mountain ranges. We have a biologist with intimate knowledge of the area. He's flown aerial surveys within these two mountain ranges for many, many years. He goes out, flies following this black path. He flies a portion of the mountain range, maybe the southern end of the mountain range, and catches the top end of the mountain range. And he does this for various reasons, but one may be that we know that that's where the greatest density of deer may be. So we're trying to target and maximize the sample that we could collect. There may be other challenges due to time constraints. We may be butting up to weekends, or there could be potential weather issues that they're encountering. In reality, most of our surveys are probably just both of those rectangles are purple. They both have passed. We've just flown as much of that as we possibly could. Now, the sample-based and polygon approach is introducing some randomization into the flights. We're providing more direction to our biologists on where they should fly and how they should fly these areas. So each of these subsections of these two mountain ranges have been divided into rectangles. In our world, when we're doing this, we're actually dividing a mountain range into sub-watersheds, so creeks that drain into more major watersheds, typically like Cave Creek, Cottonwood Creek, what have you. Those typically span from the valley floor up to a ridge line along the mountain range. But based on hydrological data, we can actually divide a mountain range up into all of these various sub-watersheds. We then randomly select which of these sub-watersheds the biologists are going to fly. So rather than having a flight where potentially due to various constraints we only covered portions of this area, we're actually trying to more appropriately cover the entire geographic range of the mountain range. However, we may not be flying everything in between each one of these sub-watersheds. Okay, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on how that works. So ultimately, what we're really trying to do with this effort, the sample-based survey approaches, is we want to optimize the timing and duration of our surveys so that when we're talking about this really tiny window of the peak rut around Thanksgiving, we can get as many of our flights around that time as we can. Granted, there's other circumstances and other characteristics of herds that may or may not necessitate those flights occurring at that time. And then ultimately, we're just trying to get the best data to input into our population models. And then finally, we want to make those informed harvest recommendations. So some of the questions that we evaluated when we were going through this effort to determine the effectiveness of a sample-based survey approach was what's the optimal count that we will need for ratios to stabilize. So again, we're talking about those ratios, but you know, the law of large numbers would indicate that the more deer that we count, eventually we're going to reach some asymptote, some ideal number of deer where that ratio is not going to go any higher or any lower. It'll eventually just stabilize and stay flat. Another question would be, will this help us fly more, get us more flights within that critical window? And then finally, can we collect data in a method that obtains these accurate ratios and precision, and then also helping us with this statistical inference that we might want to make. So this is an exercise that we did with biologists Caleb McAdoo, Tom Donham, as well as Cody Schroeder. The 2014 data set from the Ruby Mountains is shown here. The bottom line in bold, that's the actual survey result from this mountain range. So you'll see that left column percent sampled. We're looking at 100% of the sample. 6,000 deer were observed on flight, and this is our postseason flight with a fawn ratio of 59 fawns per 100 does and 29 bucks per 100 does. When we went through and we actually randomly pulled portions of this herd of this sample out, so we wanted to take that 6,000 approximately number of deer, pull a percent of those out. Let's look at what the ratios might have been from that. We'll pull 5%, 20%, 50%, all coming from this final survey number. And we're kind of assuming that those final values and ratios, that's the true value of the population at the time of the survey. And what we found is, despite the fact that we counted 6,000 deer and we had these ratios, even at about 30 to 50% of the overall sample that was collected, we're still getting very similar fawn and buck ratios to what the final ratios ended up being. So you can see here our fawn ratio ranged from 60 to 63 fawns per 100 does, and then our buck ratio was 30 to 28 bucks per 100 does, and then just comparing those values to that very bottom line, which is the line of the actual survey results from this flight. This is what that looks like on a graph. So at the bottom we have that left column, the percent sampled. On the left horizontal axis, those are our ratios. And what you can see again is there's a little bit of variation from about 1% to, I would say, 10% in what the fawn ratios look like, variability. But once we go beyond those values, we start to see that those ratios start to stabilize around a single value. And so what this information is telling us is that from about 30% to 100%, we were no longer adding value to the ratios from our survey. Now, that's not to say that flying more areas didn't provide our biologists with valuable information from their area, but from a strict data standpoint, what we saw is essentially we reached the optimum number of deer classified at about 30% of the actual survey that happened in 2014. So we wanted to take it a step further and actually look at this strategy that's been employed by other states, the sample-based survey. And what we wanted to do was we took historical data and classified all of these watersheds into bins of high, medium, and low deer densities. And then we would subsequently extract random polygons from each one of those bins of densities. And the reason we did that is we just want to capture the variability of deer densities across the landscape. We know that there's some areas where there's going to be a lot of deer, and there's other areas where those deer densities are not going to be as high. And that's based on resource availability, etc. This is what it looks like in the Ruby Mountains. You can see areas 101, 102, 103 here in this left figure. So you have the East Humboldt Range and the majority of the Ruby Mountains. And then on the right is Spruce Mountain, Unit 105. I apologize, the scale between those two areas is a little bit off. The figure on the right should probably be a little bit smaller just to be to scale. But generally what we see is there's these areas that we can identify within each of these units that show us where the high deer densities occur, where the medium deer densities occur, and then low densities. And this really did follow along with what our biologists recommended as far as these bins of deer densities across the landscape. But we did take we did use a historical data set of surveys from 2005 to 2007, 2010 to 2012, and 2014 to actually create these average deer densities where we came up with those stratifications. And so the next step was essentially doing a simulation of, well, what would a survey look like if we had done a polygon survey based on the results from our biologists. So we took this 100% survey, the entire area, and we randomly selected plots. And we pulled those plots from the area and we evaluated what did the biologists actually see within those areas. So we have 5 different simulations based on 7 years of survey data, where you can see the percentage of the area being extracted ranged from 22% for subsample 3 to 43% for subsample 5. So this is going to compare the ratios that were resulting from those actual surveys, which is the complete value on the far left. And then each bin then highlights what the results of those ratios would have been under those subsampling simulations. So on the left, again, that's the entire data set occurring from a given year. Each horizontal trend line represents a given year, and then each of those points represent a subsample simulation. And what we see is there's typically very little deviation from what the ratio is that's collected on survey compared to what these simulations resulted in. And again, we went all the way down to only 22% of the 67 available plots were selected. So somewhere around 15 to 17 plots would actually have been flown in this simulation, and we still resulted in fawn ratios that were very comparable to the actual results from the survey. We also did this for our buck ratios, and again, the simulation is on the bottom with the complete survey on the far left and our ratio values on the horizontal or the vertical axis. And again, we see very little deviation of the resulting buck ratio from the survey compared to the simulations that were conducted on these data sets. So taking it a step further, we actually wanted to make some comparisons. We did this on a historical data set, but we wanted to actually look at it on the ground and how did it work once we started to identify these various trends in our data. And so starting in 2017, our biologists recommended that we fly both the polygon survey, the sample-based approach, but that when we're flying in between those polygons, those watersheds that got selected, that they complete what was more similar to a directed search type flight. So they would kind of fall back into the historical methods. And these comparisons here, the top table for 27 and 2018, we have this directed hybrid fawn ratio. So that's where we took all the data that was collected on survey, both in the polygons and outside of the polygons, and compared that to those polygons, the sample-based approach. And what we saw in both 27 and 2018 is there was very little difference between what was collected within the polygons, where we typically collected a lot less data, where fewer deer were encountered, compared to the actual hybrid approach where we lumped everything together. So for our, just to give an example, for our hybrid fawn ratio in 2018, the resulting data was 47 fawns per 100 does, and for the just the sample, what came out of the polygons was 47.9. For our hybrid buck ratio, we had 37.1, and for just the polygons themselves, it was 37.2. So we feel very comfortable that when we're just kind of partitioning a mountain range into these blocks, that we're still getting the appropriate data that we need to inform our population models. And you can look down below. The bottom table actually shows the percent of animals that were encountered within the polygon, so that sample-based, the sample-based sample size compared to what the overall sample size was. So we were encountering about 40 to 48% of the overall deer came out of the polygons, but we were still getting these comparable ratios from those polygons themselves. So in summary, the department conducts 2 aerial surveys. We have the post-hunt survey.
Hold on a second. I think we may have a question.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
As you guys were analyzing the data here, did you guys compare just like the directed data versus just the sample-based and not include a hybrid? And was there any more deviation there?
So we don't have that. I don't have that data readily available. We wanted to try and provide a representation of what an actual deer flight would look like. So if you flew your directed search, you're getting large sample sizes, etc. We can pull that together. I could probably sit down and do that in between presentations or during the lunch break, but I don't have that readily available right now. I don't expect there to be much difference, but that's a great question.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just wrap it up. So we conduct 2 surveys, post-hunt and spring. The post-hunt survey gives us an idea of our buck ratios, the age class within our buck segment of the population, as well as fawn ratios. And our spring flights provide us with that overwinter fawn loss and then the recruitment that we use in our subsequent population models. And then finally, we think that these sample-based surveys are going to help us maybe better schedule our flights during the best times of the year. We're strategically trying to integrate these flights into our surveys into more areas in Nevada. And one thing that I didn't really cover is that this is this has a little bit more of a statistical foundation so that we can use it in things like the integrated population models that Cody Schroeder is going to talk about, and we can collect valid estimates of deer abundance on the landscape, which our current survey methods don't allow us to do. And with that, I can field questions, or we can start the next section of the.
Well, let's first questions for Mr. Yes, Commissioner Huff.
So in regard to the polygon survey strategy, are you attempting to put in randomization, or are you attempting to see if there's an easier way for you to survey that costs less time and resources, or is it both?
Commissioner Hubbs, Cody McKee for the record. I'll try and cover both of those. I think initially we were hoping that there may be some significant time savings associated with this effort, but what we found is that during a survey, if we only encounter 50% of the deer that we had kind of historically found on a flight, that may only mean that we saved about 30% of the time. So what we found in this effort is that the time savings aren't as, it's not one-to-one, but we are potentially, there's that potential there to maybe cut a day off here and a day off there, and over time we may be able to free up flight time for somebody else to get their flights in. From a pure statistical standpoint, we saw this as a opportunity to kind of get two birds with one stone. We can collect this ratio data without having our biologists in the plane or in the helicopter for any more time than they need to be. We can incorporate randomization, which from any sampling effort that needs to be included, as opposed to what we had done previously, which was we flew as much as we could when we could. And then finally, going back to these abundance estimates, at this time, we don't really have a way to calculate abundance based off of our aerial survey data, the actual numbers that are collected on the flight. So we can't convert that to a number of deer per mile squared with confidence intervals currently, but under a polygon survey where we provide direction on how a flight should be conducted with survey transects, we can get an estimate of detection along those transects and then apply that to the entire polygon, the entire stratification bin of high, medium, and low, and then ultimately to the entire mountain range.
Okay. Commissioner East.
There we go. Cody, how often do you fly each of the hunt units?
So, Commissioner East, Cody McKee for the record, we currently try to fly every unit every year. However, given these time constraints, we have certain areas where we've gone to an every other year schedule. Okay. Some years we may fly a post-hunt flight, skip the spring, and then do the next spring. It really depends on the schedule of the biologist, how long it's been since we flew it last. If Regional Supervisors Tom Donham and Mike Scott want to provide added clarification to that, they're welcome to. But in generally, we try to do every year, but it doesn't always work out in that way.
So I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, so maybe this isn't appropriate timing, but based on the flights and then the on-the-ground information that you get from your area biologists, you integrate that into what we then see for tag allocation?
Yeah, so this is just the first step.
Okay.
This is the first step of collecting those ratios that would go into our population models.
Okay.
Now, some of the information that we collect with respect to landscape, the landscape conditions, maybe it's a really heavy snow year. Potentially there's been some overwinter loss. We see deer carcasses. That may kind of provide us with some clarity on what the overall effect of the past winter might be and how that could carry through recruitment and into the subsequent fall for deer availability. Strictly from a data standpoint, it's those ratios that are the most important for our population models.
And Tom's coming to talk to me.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Commissioner East, Tom Donham for the record.
We don't necessarily fly every unit or unit group. Each year there are some unit groups. In Central Nevada, where I used to manage those resources, Area 25, Area 21, a lot of unit groups would basically result in such a small sample size it would be unusable. Statistically, it just tells you nothing. Some of those are managed more based on harvest data and stuff like that. And then regionally, every year, unit groups are usually prioritized based on, like Cody said, how long it's been since you may have flown a certain unit group, or if there's been wildfires, or politically sometimes there's more pressure to fly some areas. So just various reasons things are prioritized. Excuse me, but not everything every year, but we try to do as many unit groups as possible for the ones we think we can get usable sample sizes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Hubbs.
So in the past, the Polygon survey, you're stating that you can get an abundance estimate across your watershed units, or is it, the areas that you have put into units? But so just going back to our past estimates of population, they're just based on actual deer or elk or pronghorn found on a direct survey flight, and then that's kind of measured over a historical timeline, but there's no confidence intervals as to that estimate?
Commissioner Hubbs, Cody McKee for the record, that's correct. Our current population estimates are based on a spreadsheet model. Essentially, it keeps track of the number of animals that enter into a population based on recruitment, an estimate of what's died, what's lost through harvest, and then we have survival rates that track those animals through time. But currently, we don't have confidence intervals around those population estimates. It's a point estimate, and so we typically expect that the actual number probably falls within 20% plus or minus of the number that we publish. But again, with these integrated population models that the department's investigating right now, this is actually something that we're going to be able to produce in the future.
Tony.
Thank you, Chair. To kind of follow up on that, I mean, this is a constant process of refinement. And if we look back into the 50s and 60s, we had biologists that were doing track counts. They were dragging areas with sand and then coming back and counting tracks in those areas and using that to generate a population estimate. And then in the mid-70s, the department went to aerial surveys, did the area directed search, used a change in ratio model, and that change in ratio was largely based on the change in the observed buck ratio. And you would estimate a population, you would take out the known harvest and look at the resulting change in that observed ratio, and that would give you an indication whether that population was overestimated or underestimated. That part of the challenge is that weather conditions and timing of survey have a huge effect on observed buck ratios. And so if you look back at population estimates for mule deer in Nevada at a time when we used the change in ratio model, it looks like a seismograph during an earthquake where from year to year it'd be way up and it'd be way down. And then the state went to a POP2 model, kind of a canned population estimate program that many western states used, and it was kind of a black box model using a mortality severity index. But the limitations of that model was that it couldn't model through an extreme catastrophic event like the winter of '92-'93, and so it was shortly after that that we began to look for another modeling alternative. And landed on this accounting spreadsheet model. So if you look at the variation in population estimates for mule deer through time, you'll see initially they were incredibly variable year to year, and then when we switched to the POP2 model, that smoothed it out a little bit, and then we went to the accounting model, and that almost flattened it out with a slight negative slope. And so there's, they say models are tools for thinkers, not crutches for the thoughtless. They're only as good as the data that goes in. So this is a constant process of refinement. And the refinement isn't only on the modeling side that we'll hear shortly, but it's also on the survey side. And to that, I wanted to speak to a couple things that Cody mentioned too. He talked about those ratios, fawn ratios and buck ratios that we use to, the words he used here on the second bullet point is to inform the population model. The other word he had was calibrate. The fawn ratio, the observed fawn ratio in the spring is really what's driving that population. That tells us if the population is increasing or if it's decreasing. And then the magnitude of the population, the buck ratio really tells us if we're overestimating or underestimating. The challenge is getting those accurate buck ratios, and we've talked about, you know, that Thanksgiving week, and we've talked about personnel challenges, and we've talked about an aggressive flight schedule. The other thing that challenges us in getting accurate buck ratios is we don't want to fly over bull elk hunters. We talk about people's investment in the system and the bonus points. We're trying to be cognizant of other users out there, and at the same time we're trying to get the best data so that we can have the highest level of confidence in our surveys, to have the highest level of confidence in the input in our models. We're trying to be cognizant of other users in the field. Cody said that those spring flights are the most important point, and we've had some discussion with the commission and the cabs about the quota setting process, and could we do it earlier, and could we have the draw earlier. This is one of the key constraints on the quota setting process. The confidence, again, Cody's words, is the most important data point for mule deer are those spring flights. That's where the agency's confidence, the biologist's confidence in overwinter survival comes from, and that's what's telling us whether those populations are going up and down. So if we moved that quota setting process for mule deer before that mortality that's going to be experienced by those populations has reached its end, or if we're surveying, you know, before that, or we're setting a quota before that survey, then it potentially introduces an added layer of conservatism based on the lack of confidence. The one other point, I think Commissioner Hubbs, you already talked about why randomization, and Cody talked about you know, the statistical value, the power, but I think the other part is just if the data don't change, but we could look at more areas and have more confidence and more accuracy and more precision in other areas, you know, you reach that point of diminishing returns in terms of just the ratios that you're trying to get. So we could potentially be more effective, be more efficient, and have better data simultaneously with more statistical power with that data. So.
Right. In terms of the randomization, I think it's important too to weed. It kind of weeds out that bias, that inherent bias we have when we go on those direct survey flights. Like, you get so used to seeing certain patterns, and you're not going into other areas. And inadvertently, over time, you may discover something like a shift or a change in resources or something with those. And we all have inherent biases. That's just how we are as human beings, right? So the randomization kind of takes a little bit of that away from the survey, the direct survey approach.
Yeah, Commissioner Hubbs, I might, there's a couple things that I thought of while Tony was speaking, and as well as yourself. One is, I'm not trying to undervalue what we do for our postseason, post-hunt flights. As Tony alluded to, we are collecting buck ratios, which is extremely important for our modeling process, as well as the kind of the overall view that our biologists get of their resource area. The second thing that comes to mind, and now I'm drawing a blank. Too much coffee this morning. I might have to come back to it. Yeah.
So just one more question. So if I have this right, if you have the fall survey, you find that there are too many bucks to does, you have underestimated. I mean, the quota was not set high enough. Is that right? Or there was low performance in the field for the hunt season?
Yeah, Commissioner Hubbs, that is correct. So if we came in with a astronomically high buck ratio, especially in a large population like the Ruby Mountains. A lot of times that indicates that we did underestimate the population, because ultimately it's the population estimate that comes out of the spreadsheet model, as well as the composition of available bucks that comes out of the spreadsheet model that goes into our demand success formulas to calculate the tags that we allocate. And so yeah, that can be used to give us an idea of maybe we're missing the mark. Then we come in and we can make adjustments so that we're better addressing those discrepancies.
I might just add, you're exactly right. If you have a population estimate with an observed ratio, you can say that X number are male and X number are female. Then when you have required mandatory harvest reporting, you know what was taken out of that population, and you can apply that to the estimated number of males and females and project what the resulting buck ratio should be. So you have a predicted buck ratio known on the estimated population and makeup of males and females subtracting the known harvest. You have a predicted observed buck ratio, and when that observed buck ratio varies from that, it's an indication of whether you've overestimated, underestimated, or you're really good.
Yeah, and Commissioner Hubbs, I did think of my second point, and you had mentioned the inherent bias that gets built into our surveys potentially because I've heard the term hot spotting. I believe we have highly qualified biologists, and I don't think that we do that intentionally. In fact, as I indicated, we try to fly as much of the area as possible. It is possible, though, at times, because of time limitations, maybe weather constraints, we would fly over an area where we know that deer densities are low, or maybe they're medium, they've been classified in those medium bins, because we just don't have the time to spend searching it. What the polygon approach does, the sample-based approach does, is we direct our crews to those areas, and we require them to fly those plots. It set protocol within specific contours, so we know those areas are being covered, and we can be confident that we're capturing the deer that may reside within.
Just a quick question. So you do the post-hunt survey. If you observe a high buck-doe ratio there, higher than, let's say, an objective or what you would expect, then you look at the harvest results. If for some reason, let's say the harvest results, really low hunter success, you would take that into account and say, well, maybe we were right, but we had poor hunter success. But we can also, I guess, do the vice versa. If you see really low buck-to-doe ratio, and let's say the hunter success was on par with prior years, and you say maybe we overestimated the population and vice versa, but you're looking at all those data points.
We are looking at all those data points, but we're subtracting that known harvest from the population estimate before we look at the hunter success as far as a percentage. And we take that out because it's totally independent of what hunter success was. It's just known mortality. You take that known mortality out, you look at the resulting population, comparing that with your observed value. When we go to set the quota, and we'll get to that point, we look at the 3-year average on hunter success, and there are certainly situations, and I think we'll talk about some of those, where that success formula doesn't work well because things spiral out of control. If you have a unit with a small number of tags and circumstances where for some reason or another there's a really low hunter success, the formula would suggest you jack the quota, but that can reach diminishing returns. And so in some of those instances, we have to exercise some discretion so that doesn't spiral out of control and recommend way more tags than the population might support or the experience might lend itself to.
Okay. Finished? Questions? Ready to move on to the next topic then? Is that going to be you or the other Cody?
So I'm going to pass the baton off to other Cody, and he'll be with you the rest of the day.
All right, well, it's a little after 12, and we got through the brief welcome in Cody McKee's presentation. Why don't we take a break for lunch now? Be back at, I think, 1:15. Should give everyone plenty of time. I don't,